What I want to do today, and by all means feel free to interrupt me, it'll keep us all awake anyway, is talk a bit about a piece of research which is being funded currently by NCVER, looking at cross-occupational skills transferability, challenges and opportunities in a changing economy, with my colleague Victor Kakara at RMIT University in Crystal Gut. Basically, this particular project consists of three stages, and today I'm going to largely talk about two of them, or bits and pieces out of the two stages, which we have more or less completed at this point. The first stage of the project was really trying to get our head around, what are the growing and declining occupations? So looking at the ABS data, we hear a lot about changing industries and job losses from industries, job growth in other industries, but what does it mean when we take an occupational approach to the question? Which occupations are growing and declining? We heard a bit about that last night over dinner, which rather futuristic I found, but nonetheless. So that was the first part, and then the second part is really thinking about the training system itself and to what degree the training system has been designed in ways that enables occupational mobility, particularly across diverse occupations, and the importance of transferable skill sets and transferable skills. So there we're looking at qualifications and training packages primarily to explore that sort of question. And it's those two that I'm going to talk about today. The third part of the study, which is what we are currently doing at the moment, are a couple of case studies. And so that then becomes the question, what happens in practice? For a worker in transition, to what degree does their skill sets that they developed in a particular job over a number of years and the qualification that they have assist them in finding alternative work? And what are the role of JSAs, training providers, government departments involved in facilitating workers in that transition process? How do they understand transferable skills? And so the case study component of that is currently underway. The two sites for that research is the Latrobe Valley in Victoria and Geelong, two regions undergoing significant change, different types of industries, different types of occupations, but nonetheless significant challenges for workers in those areas. Okay. I don't think I need to tell this group here about how much Australia's economy is changing. We hear about it in the papers regularly. Lots of job losses across a range of sectors. Automobiles are disappearing, automobile industry is disappearing, smelters are shutting down, job losses in the mining industry, public sector jobs going, and so forth. At the same time, and we heard about this last night as well, full-time work is increasingly becoming a thing of the past. The full-time job is being replaced by people having to knit together a whole range of casual part-time work. And so, at the same time, of course, that's the rather pessimistic picture, we see lots of job growth occurring in education, healthcare and community services, construction from time to time, and so on. So we're an economy in transition. There are significant challenges for all of us in that transition process, raising particular questions about occupational mobility and how and in what ways are we prepared for what was said last night, we're all going to have 17 jobs and 6 careers or whatever it was. And You know, that those sorts of things are talked about. I'm not sure that it's on a foundation of strong evidence, but nonetheless, this is what's often said. So in that particular situation, to what degree do we have skill sets that enable us to move across a range of occupations? So the question of occupational mobility is really where we are focusing and trying to understand that both in terms of where jobs are growing and declining, but also the training system itself. These pictures here are of what was Australia's dirtiest power station, the Morwell Power Station in the Latrobe Valley, which was shut down about a year ago. And these are a couple of workers who are looking at the station that's still sitting there but no longer operating, contemplating their future as to where they're going to go next. So I'm going to return to these two gentlemen at the end to try and pull the pieces together of what does this all actually mean in terms of workers in transition and occupational mobility. Okay. The question of transferable skills. Now, when we talk about transferable skills as being critically important in occupational mobility, what do we actually mean? Generally, it's talked about highly generalized skills that can be used across a whole range of occupations. Some refer to them as soft skills and so on. But the idea that these skills can be used in a range of occupational contexts. There are no purely transferable skills, I don't think, nor are there purely non-transferable skills. It's not easy to put into boxes, although this is commonly done. Okay? And I think it's useful to talk about levels of transferability, and others suggest that this is a much more useful way to do it as well. Now, when we talk about what are the transferable versus the non-transferable skills, there's a range of typologies or ways in which people present this, from technical, which are largely non-transferable, to the non-technical, which are seen as more easily transferable to a range of occupations. Some refer to academic competence or generic skills, which are more transferable as opposed to work-related and technical. And then, of course, there's this whole debate about the relationship between skills, knowledge, and attitudes, and the importance of attitudes increasingly in the labor market, particularly if you're looking for a job, and the ways that employers are recruiting nowadays. And for some, then, there's this trying to move beyond some of these debates, moving into a more holistic approach, which forces us to think about the relationship between knowledge, skills, as well as aptitudes and attitudes, and so on and so forth. Now, in all of this debate, of course, there's high levels of subjectivity and bias as to how we define what is a transferable skill versus a non-transferable skill. What's a soft skill versus a technical skill? And is one soft skill in one industry actually one's technical skill in another industry, particularly service-based, service-oriented work? Okay. So there are these definitional problems associated with it, which we acknowledge in this. And it does come up, and my colleagues and I have had some rather heated arguments about this as well, as to, what is a soft skill? What is a hard skill? How do we think about that in relation to a particular occupational context? Are these particular typologies useful? Now, one of the works that was really important for us in thinking about this was work that the European Commission had done, where they were, if you like, grappling with the same sort of challenges and trying to understand transferable skills across 12 countries. So a much larger study than what we've attempted to do. But for them, they came up with this model, or a 3 typology, thinking about soft skills, generic hard skills, and specific hard skills as a way to categorize skills. For them, this soft skills, generic hard skills are seen as relatively transferable, okay, as opposed to the specific hard skills, the technical, highly job-specific, applicable to only a few occupations. And so we've put together this sort of diagram to get us to think about, we have 3 very different occupations. Yes, they all share some sort of soft skills, which largely we would talk about as foundation skills, right? Issues related to learning, literacy, numeracy, oral communication, that sort of thing. And then the generic hard skills, which, from our standpoint, we're going to talk about employability skills. Now, I think employability skills, when you read a lot of what has been written in Australia, employability skills are often used synonymously with soft skills, and I'm trying to make the argument, I don't think that's necessarily true. Because of the way we see employability skills embedded in qualifications in very particular types of ways, that interaction makes them move beyond that sort of soft skill category which the European Commission put together. Okay. So within the Australian context, this interest in the importance of developing transferable skills has been, around for many, many years. And the employability skills framework was certainly seen as a critical aspect of that. And so employability skills was a way in which the Australian training system sought to develop those skills which could be, if you like, moved across a range of occupations and facilitate that workers' ability to maneuver in a changing labor market. Now, obviously, we're not allowed to talk about employability skills much longer because of changes, but nonetheless, we'll continue on with this. So what are the employability skills? And for many in the room, I don't think I need to probably spend much time on this, and I don't think I will. But communication, teamwork, problem solving, initiative and enterprise, planning and organizing, self-management, learning, and technology. Now the technology one sort of becomes quite interesting, particularly for workers in their, say, 40s, 50s, who've been retrenched, lost their jobs. That's sort of the employability skill that's missing for some of them, particularly as they have to deal with having to upload resumes and deal with all sorts of new ways of going about job searching and that sort of thing. So, employability skills. So, as we then go into the research itself, there are those 2 stages that I talked about. Let's identify growing and declining occupations. Let's select a few of these occupations to try and think about what is the relationship between these different occupations. Now, I'm only going to talk about one skill level, and that's skill level 3. Now, why we've gone about thinking about occupations in terms of skill levels is that for us, occupational mobility and skills transferability is largely going to be horizontal. Right? If you're going to move up skill levels, vertical mobility, typically there's going to be some level of retraining or upskilling. Okay? So we did our analysis looking at the various skill levels and thinking about, okay, well, where are the declining occupations at the various skill levels? And we did it for all of them. But I only want to focus on skill level 3, which are what we would describe as skilled or trade-oriented type occupations, typically a Cert 4 or Cert 3. Okay. And so you see, some ways not surprising given what we know is happening in the economy. We see some of those traditional occupations in heavy industry disappearing. Tool makers, engineering, pattern makers, boat builders, shipwrights, these sorts of things declining. Shears, agriculture. Right? While at the same time we see promising areas such as chefs, plumbers, electricians, as the construction industry generates some levels of work. So the question for us then becomes, what is the relationship between these occupations? So if I'm a printer, what are my options, right? And we could select, these are just for illustrative purposes. Right? We could select any range of industries. And so for us, in this next stage that I want to talk about, is just looking at a few of these and getting us to thinking about the relationship and occupational mobility between them. So we begin with secretaries and personal assistants. So secretaries are in decline, and in fact on the list, secretaries, let me go back to that. Secretaries witnessed significant job loss, more than any other occupation. Now, I haven't seen in the media much, concern about all these secretaries who have lost their jobs. It's been about people working for Ford and Holden and so on and so forth. But that's huge, okay? And so, we thought, well, what are the options there for secretaries? And let's take the most obvious one, which is personal assistants, which is a growing occupation. Okay? So let's look at ANSCO categories in terms of secretaries and personal assistants and how they are described in terms of the tasks that they perform. And I won't go into any major detail there. You can read it. There's probably too much on that slide, as my colleague said anyway. But you get an idea that, there's not a lot of difference between the two in terms of the task that they're expected to perform. Okay? This issue about supervising other secretarial and clerical staff is one of the defining aspects of what's the difference between a secretarial position and a personal assistant position. Right? So there's something there. Now, what sort of qualifications do you have to do a secretarial's role as opposed to a personal assistant's roles? Well, typically they both require the same certificate. Okay? So there, in terms of mobility and occupational mobility, it's relatively straightforward. They're both drawing upon the same certificate. One can make a pretty strong argument that, well, I've got the skills for a personal assistant's role if I've got the same qualification when I was working in that secretarial role. Okay. So that's one point. Now, employability skills, and what we did, we took the European Commission's framework, went through the various skills contained in that qualification, and put them into the categories of generic hard skills and specific hard skills. And we have put the employability skills associated with some of those skills there. And so what you see, and this is why I say employability skills have to be understood in relation to the occupation or contextualized within the occupation, is because how they come to be codified, if you like, or contextualized, is in relation to that occupation. Okay? So reading and interpreting workplace-related documentation, planning for contingencies, working ethically when dealing with financial transactions. Yes, they're employability skills, but they're employability skills related to a very particular type of occupation. And indeed, in specific hard skills, you see problem-solving skills to identify the intellectual property and compliance issues. It's an employability skill, but it's at a very specific hard skill level related to that occupation. So employability skills, I think, it's a bit more complicated than it's often thought about. So, if we go back and trying to create that diagram, you'd see these two occupations very closely aligned with one another and overlapping on both soft skills, generic hard skills, and largely on specific hard skills. Okay. Let's take a different example. The wood machinists, lots of them are finding it difficult to find jobs. It's an occupation where there's not a lot of demand for. Carpenters and joiners, that's a growing occupation. Let's do the same exercise if you like. Tasks include, for wood machinists, we see lots of similarities in terms of the tasks they perform, the tools they use, and indeed the materials they work on, as what the carpenters do. Now, I think this is a rather important registration or licensing may be required for carpenters, which can be certainly a challenge for that occupational mobility, and certainly there's going to be a level of additional competencies and upskilling required there. Right. Let's then think about the training packages or the qualifications that are associated with each one of those. They're different, quite significantly different. Timber and composites machining versus Cert 3 in joinery. And once again, and I won't go through all the details found in that slide, and I'm happy to provide these slides to everyone. You can see lots of similarities in the ways in which the generic hard skills relate to the generic hard skills found in the two occupations, or the two certificates, I should say. The ways in which employability skills become emphasized become largely shaped by the nature of the occupation, so there's a greater emphasis on workplace safety, OH&S, and so on, if you compare it to our previous two occupations of secretarial and personal assistance. So the types of generic soft skills, yes, they enable a degree of transferability, but we need to think of that in relation to occupations and the demands of those occupations. Specific hard skills, yes, we see similar types of activities in terms of what they work with, what they're expected to do, what they're able to do across the two industries, although differences in some cases with what they're actually performing or what they're working on. So you see this sort of movement away from one another in terms of what we can think about as the transferability options between the wood machinist and the joiner. And the specific hard skills and specific hard skills, you know, there's some level of commonality there, but we're dealing with different certificates and different requirements of those particular occupations. It's not like our previous example. And then we go to this extreme example. Let's think about the shears versus the chefs. Right? And it just seems ridiculous, right? How can the shear become the chef? How can they just shift across these types of occupations? All right? And when we do that same exercise, thinking about the types of tasks that the shearer performs versus the chef, you know, perhaps maybe treating skin cuts it might be about all we could tease out of that. Okay. So very different types of work, different types of tasks expected to be performed. And once again, then we do the same exercise, looking at the respective qualifications for those two occupations. Cert 4 in shearing, Cert 4 in commercial cookery. Okay. And there's not, there are aspects there, whether it's working in teams, communicating in particular types of ways, where you can say, look, there are some transferable skills there. And indeed, that's actually important, because for the shearer, they don't quite often understand that, and I don't think we often always understand that. That, yeah, that occupation, that's clearly out of my reach. I can't even think about it because there's no way that my skills can transfer to that setting. But there are. There are skills that have been developed doing that type of work, whether it's the ways in which one communicates, using basic technological skills, managing time, all those sorts of things. Okay. And I think that's important. But it often gets overlooked. So, but let's be honest, we're moving farther and farther apart when we're going to talk about this sort of skills transferability and occupational mobility. It's not going to be an easy process. And when you put in that CV as the shearer for the chef's job, you probably won't get very far. Okay? So the occupational mobility prospects are low. So what's the implication? And the implication becomes this story, which is often presented, which is presented in this comic here. As economies, industries, and occupations change, this is increasingly what we're finding. People able to talk about their skills and what they've been doing and how good they're able to do things that they've been doing for many, many years, meeting an employer that says, oh yeah, that's all very fine and good, but can you do X? And I think what then becomes lost in that is being able to think about, well, there probably are things that I have learned that it could assist me quite well in doing sales. There are things in my job. There are things that actually I learned through doing my certificate, a very different certificate, but those employability skills that I can draw upon and talk about and so forth. So, through doing this exercise, I do think there becomes a need to rethink occupational mobility and skills transferability. And increasingly, for us, the importance is, it's not just simply identifying here are the transferability skills, and let's put that in a list, and let's say those transferable skills are going to assist you in all sorts of different occupations. I think it's more complicated than that. And it's important for us to start thinking more about families of occupations and the ways in which skill sets are relatively common to whole groups of families of occupations, if we're going to talk about occupational mobility and options for workers. Options for workers that don't require a whole significant amount of retraining. Okay. Now, this is where I'm largely going to finish up. And it's, dare I do this, given my accent, but in the United States, career clusters are commonly talked about. Occupational clusters are commonly talked about to get us to think about the ways in which groups and families of occupations share certain common skills sets and competencies. Okay. There's an acknowledgement that yes, there's this foundation knowledge which all occupations rely upon. Okay. But at the same time, there are a whole range of occupations, and the U.S.'s various websites are very good at categorizing, where a lot of, over many, many years, lots of studies have been done on occupations and what skills are actually required of this occupation, and let's map that then onto other occupations and try and understand the relationship between groups of occupations. Okay. And they've developed what they call this occupational cluster model. And it makes us think about relationships between occupations in diverse industries in all sorts of new ways, which the ANSCO categories don't really let us do. Okay? And so, you know, manufacturing, transport and logistics, architecture and construction, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, connected to an industrial and engineering technology career pathways, where particular skills, transferable, generic skills, become developed that are utilized across a whole range of occupations in those areas. And we think that that's a much more useful way, given our findings that we've developed, to start us to think about occupational mobility prospects among workers in transition. The OECD itself has increasingly acknowledged the importance of pathways and cluster approaches in terms of developing that sort of flexibility for potential workers in transition in occupational mobility. And I think there's more work to be done in that area within the Australian context. Now, let me tell you an example why. So I'm back to my guys here in the Latrobe Valley, looking at the power station that they once worked for. The one had worked there, left school at 14, 15, and straight into the SEC, which was the State Electricity Commission of Victoria at the time, and had worked in the power generation industry ever since. Okay? Lost his job last year. The other guy, very similar type experience. And so they were unit controllers in an aging power station, coal-fired, dirty, carbon-intensive power station, of which this country has to come to terms with. Right? The question becomes for them, what transferable skills do they have? For them, they can largely only think about the prospects of getting a job in one of those other power stations whose shelf life is largely over. Okay? And so they spend a lot of their time trying to get into one of the other power stations, because they think they have such highly specialized skills that there's no other industry for them to possibly work. There's no other occupations out there. Now, the Latrobe Valley is surrounded by dairy country, agri-food industries. There are dairies, and then many doing well. And you think about the work that's involved in a dairy. Are there any jobs in the dairy sector which these guys might be able to do? And there's not much thinking about that, right? What do these guys do? It's all about regulating power, heat, steam, and so on. That's what goes on with unit controllers and dairies. Okay? But because we tend to have an industry occupational mindset, it becomes hard to think about occupations in relation to other industry clusters. And when I talk to JSAs and local government authorities and RDV, Regional Development Victoria, and others, there's not much thinking about retrofitting these guys into some other occupation which is actually very similar, but in a different industry. And I think as we begin to reshape our thinking about relationship between occupations beyond that sort of industry focus, we might be able to resolve some of these difficult challenges for these types of workers in transition. So I leave it at that.
I'm happy to open the floor up to questions if people have any.
In 2000, I was in Newcastle when the BHP closed down, and we had a program, government-sponsored program, where we took BHP workers and retrained them as telecommunications workers. Now, the level of success of that is sort of a bit marginal, because a lot of them simply did the training to get the handout. went on to retire on their bonuses and things. Others made the transition, others didn't feel at home. There were a lot of, it wasn't just the skills that they had, it was about the dislocation and the, you know, a lot of other things that were actually a lot more important than whether they had the skills or not.
Yep.
The second point I'd like to make is you've based your work on the training packages in the AQF.
Yep.
And those qualifications are achieved at the beginning of a person's career.
Yep.
And of course, that's only a very small part of what skills and knowledge they've acquired. So I don't know that the language, which is really what that was about, the language that was analysed within the training package and the competencies, really reflects the much broader skills that were there. One of the other presenters was talking about earlier the level of confidence that was developed by working in an environment and innovation and a whole lot of other things that come that just aren't defined in the AQF or in a training package. So I think there's a lot of other factors that perhaps would have been interesting to see how they impacted on that.
Absolutely, I agree with you 100% on that. And so for us, this second stage was very much just looking about the training architecture. In the third stage is where we start to get into that detail. And I've done a range of interviews, both with retrenched workers and JSAs and training organizations and so on. These guys here, for example. And, you know, for them, and in some cases, the skills that are assisting them in getting new lines of work often relate to hobbies. You know, stuff that they've been doing over a number of years in, you know, the shed, or, you know, the shearer might be a astounding cook, you know, a chef at home. And it becomes those skills that are part of that person that they're then able to draw upon to help them in, you know, the certificate itself doesn't necessarily become all that important. But for us in that exercise was just looking at the training system and the way it's designed.
Yeah, you mentioned when you talked about last month's observation that people might train across numerous jobs and industries, and as someone who's come from that sort of background, I thought it was really interesting because being through that experience, I know that whilst there may be a whole load of transferable skills that people have, getting employers to actually recognise them can be hugely difficult, you know, from a job seeker perspective. Also, I think as the education sector gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's more qualifications and certificates, and it almost becomes like a big structural issue. You know, for anyone who wants to change, they've got to almost take a complete reset, go back to school, train, or alternatively take on that on top of their existing workload. So it seems to me that there's jobs that you may have just been able to have started in part when people saw that you had transferable skills, and now getting more and more, you know, educationalised.
Yeah. And as qualifications become more and more and more important, and that's a serious issue. Particularly as we fragment further and further with qualifications linked to particular occupations. It becomes, you know, at some point maybe there will be an entirely separate certificate for the secretary as opposed to the personal assistant, you know. Probably not unreasonable to think that may occur. The other thing I think, and back to an earlier point I made about that relationship between skills, knowledge, and attitude, aptitude, whatever. One of the challenges for those guys there, as they desperately think that their best chance is getting a job in dwindling numbers of jobs in the power industry, is that the power industry is not interested in recruiting people on the basis of skills. They are, but the first protocol is what did he say? A 3-hour aptitude test that these guys have to take. And that's how they're weeding them out. So yeah, they've got the skill set, but they can't get through the aptitude process. And that's extremely daunting. And there's a skill associated with that, which they're completely unfamiliar with. And learning it at the age of 50 about how you do that is huge.
Yes. You're probably very aware of it because that's your work, and that's the vocational streams work of H. Martin Institute.
No.
There's a flyer in all of our packets. It's an NCVER funded thing. It's been going on for 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
And at the end of July, there's one in Melbourne and one in Sydney. So it's the opposite to what you just said about, will we have a separate qualification from the secretary to the other, you know.
No, I know this.
This is Will and Hannah, that group, who are worried about, you know, how specific everything's got. And what's interesting, because I saw your USA one, I'm still trying to get my head around it, and that's what these 2 sessions are about, but they've got 5 what they call vocational streams. One of them is logistics as the concept. You know, so it's sort of another version of the USA one, but somewhat different. So I just thought it's a very interesting piece of work. I can't quite get my mind around where it will lead us, but that's our first go in Australia, as you say, to try and bunch up into vocational streams with all the occupations as a subset coming off, something in the middle, to try and get us more generic versus the, you know, the specifics in the way we put together the training package and all of that.
Oh, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, no, certainly follow that up.
There are no other questions?
I was just thinking about the comment earlier about being employers that recognise it, which shows people with RPL. So if RPL is structured around the qualifications, and the qualifications don't tackle all those skills of being employer.
Yep. Well, and there's the other aspect to that is how these workers are informed about going about the RPL process. Because some of those automobile workers have been RPL'd into qualifications of which there are no more jobs. So, you know, great to have the certificate in the job that I've been doing for the past 30 years, but those jobs don't exist anymore. And perhaps one should think about RPLing into certificates where there are job opportunities, at least, and then skill gapping. Yeah.
Okay. Well, on behalf of NCVER, UWS and the other conference organisers, thank you, Darren, very much for presenting.
Thank you very much. Great.